If you've been reading the newspaper or watching television, you're at least peripherally aware that there are some incredible advances going on in the field of genetics and biotechnology. But if we don't understand these advances, we may be subject to some incredible consequences, not only as a country, but perhaps even as a species. I also want to put forward the controversial idea that it might be time for science to truly account for intelligence, that maybe intelligence is literally a force in the universe. The genesis of this presentation is a video that I saw on the TED website. TED is a conference that takes place every spring by the leading thinkers in the world. It takes place in Monterey. The video I saw was created from a speech or a presentation by Juan Enriquez, who is a noted biotech expert. Enriquez described gene sequencing, which is taking place in both public and private enterprises. It's using gigantic computers to decode the genome. What Enriquez described in his video is how the syntax of code is critical. This, for example, is the sequence code from the Ebola virus. And if you notice, it's a sequence of letters, ACTG, in different combinations. How these symbols are arranged is critically important to how the organism functions. And in fact, we can now reprogram organisms, as we probably know. And potentially, Enriquez described how we might be able to regrow body parts and cure some horrible diseases. He was saying that literally, the genetic code in an apple works exactly the same way as a computer code on a flash drive or a floppy disk. When Enriquez describes the apple as an application, think about what that means. We already work with certain very complex computer applications. Many of us work with Photoshop or with PowerPoint, and these are executables in the same way that Enriquez describes the apple in his video. For example, this is a macro in Word that creates a red box. And if I change the code in the macro, I can make that box green, or I can turn that box into a circle. If we realize that genetic code is identical to computer code, we can see that it's decodable only because it has meaning to it. But it's intentionally structured to accomplish a task. So an application executes lines of code in order to accomplish a task. Now, the fact of the matter is that evolutionary theory is sufficient to account for the complexity of life. As Richard Dawkins describes in his book, The Selfish Gene, however, even evolution requires a replicator, something that begins to copy itself, which is an application. The replicator, or the first, most primitive virus that began to copy itself and evolve into more complex life, was already executing code. But let's step back from the philosophy for a second and take a dose of reality, because we're still talking about genetics. This is my mother in happier days in La Jolla when she and my father retired. But my mother was selected to live by Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz. She was selected to live by him because she was healthy enough to build airplanes as a slave laborer. And when she was liberated, she went outside and she laid back on a meadow and she felt around her on the grass and she found 3 4-leaf clovers, which gave her some hope for the future. I still have those 4-leaf clovers, and I still have the cigarette case. And I keep them as a recollection of what can happen if an elite few that has very advanced scientific knowledge takes it upon itself to use that knowledge to the detriment of mankind. Because we know that the Nazis used computers and they used genetics in their efforts to subjugate mankind. For example, we know that they embraced eugenics and social Darwinism. And eugenics, by the way, grew out of the United States. It came out of the Carnegie Institute in the United States. The Rockefeller Institute in the United States funded the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. One of its main scientists was named for sure, and his student was Joseph Mengele, who did horrific experiments on twins in the concentration camps, and also selected my mother to live. What you may not know is that IBM Corporation supplied holorith machines, which were very early computers, to the Nazis. These holorith machines were used originally in the American census, and later they became the first genetic databases in Nazi Germany. They were used to identify the individuals that were earmarked for extermination. And be clear about this. This is not just Jews. These were homosexuals, political dissidents, gypsies, anyone who the elite oligarchy or the elite power structure considered to be dangerous. If you want to know more about the role of IBM holorith machines in Nazi Germany, Read Edwin Black's IBM and the Holocaust. Now, am I saying that modern genetics is necessarily fascist or Nazi? Of course not. As I've outlined, there are tremendous potential advances to be gained from biotechnology in the field of genetics. But if we continue just watching Britney Spears on television, and we don't pay attention to what's going on in these advanced sciences, we may be subject to subjugation by an elite that does understand science and takes advantage of it to maintain power. But returning to the philosophy of what we've discovered in genetics, this is not an argument for intelligent design, because it's more than just about complexity. We know that through evolution, a very primitive organism can evolve, if it replicates, into a very complex organism. But what we don't understand, even at the moment, even if we pretend to understand it, is what programming really means and how programming came about in nature. I think in terms of trying to understand it, the use of an anthropomorphic creator or primordial programmer, if you will, is not a reasonable argument, and it's not a helpful argument. In many cases, the word God is like the use of a variable in programming. When you create an application, you declare a variable. It's very possible that as living applications that execute code, we can give meaning to a variable like God simply by how we live. The parable of Noah may make sense as a story about data backup. You've got a planet whose life is in peril, that's facing disaster. How do you protect life on that planet? Well, you build an ark. In antiquity, that's what people would understand. Today, they may understand that what you're doing is backing up the genetic data of a planet, and what an ark might really be is a flash drive. But what all this also shows is that there's a limit to our logic. Because as we discover that from a virus to an apple, life is literally programmed, we have to ask ourselves, how did the initial impetus to replicate come about? Now, some scientists can lead us to believe that in some primordial ooze, an electric charge, maybe a lightning storm, caused inanimate molecules to begin replicating, and that's how life started. And you're welcome to that belief, and if it satisfies you, that's fine. But I think when you're talking about an application and you're talking about code that we sequenced and from which we've extracted meaning, it's more realistic to think that there's already intentionality at work somewhere, even though it goes against our logic, because we still have to account for where the intentionality came from. But the fact of the matter is, executing code, even at the most primitive level, separates an animate object from an inanimate object. And it's really about a decision. It's about intentionality. Executing code doesn't happen by accident. Because, again, an application is very different in terms of its very being from an inanimate object. We know that in our soul. I know that's a dangerous word to use. But the fact of the matter is, even if it's inconvenient for science, being implies intelligence. If being is an application, and it's executing lines of code, whether they're simple or whether they're complex, even if it's not a designer, even if there's no anthropomorphic programmer, it is illogical. It's inconvenient for science. The fact of the matter is, it speaks to the presence of intelligence in the universe. Another way to look at it is, if we had discovered the genetic code that we've extracted from our cells, the genetic code, if that had come down from an electron telescope in outer space, and the scientists who were at the electron telescope looked at that code and they saw that it was capable of being sequenced and that it was an application, we would say, oh my God, there's intelligent life out there. So science has to somehow address the fact of the existence of intelligence in nature. And to kill ourselves over ideas, especially ideas like primitive theology, doesn't make any sense any longer. And in some cases, if we don't remain vigilant about that, an educated elite could subjugate an uneducated masses, and it could lead to horrible consequences for humanity. And finally, I think in terms of what we've discovered about the nature of life itself, that it is literally the result of programming, we have to somehow come to terms with the existence of intelligence in nature. Thanks for your attention. This is dedicated to my parents.